And you currently are an anchor at KTLA,
Reporter at KTLA in Los Angeles.
reporter. Cool. So tell me about your experience in Vegas. When did you work here?
I worked in Las Vegas for KLAS TV in the 1980s and 90s, early 90s, for about 3 years or so.
And how did you run into Jeff Gehrman?
Well, Jeff and I were part of the same circle of friends. We hung out together socially, and then we saw each other a lot on stories because you were always running into Jeff. I mean, he covered the courts, he covered the mob. He made a name for himself covering the mob. He was just an excellent reporter, the best reporter, one of the best reporters I've ever known. I mean, every day you'd wake up in the morning and there'd be some incredible scoop that he had. Back then, he worked for the Las Vegas Sun. And you'd ask him, "Hey, Jeff, what are you working on?" And he'd say, "I can't talk about it. It's big, but I can't talk about it." And sure enough, it would be big. And you'd open up the newspaper the next day and there'd be some crazy story that nobody else had, that he had. And he was just, his whole life was devoted to being a reporter. And then sadly, his death, he died because he was such a good reporter. He was murdered because he was such a good reporter.
Yeah, definitely so tragic. I'm glad that there was justice served before the 2 year mark of his death. What were some of your favorite memories with him?
I mean, we we just like we'd go out for drinks or food. I mean, he really liked a place called Fridays, which is I don't think it's even there anymore. It used to be on Flamingo, TGI Fridays. That was the place where journalists and people who were not working in the gaming industry would hang out on Friday nights. He liked to go there a lot. We had again this circle of friends, and I went to his sister's wedding in Milwaukee. Um, that his brother-in-law is a cartoonist with the Sun. Um, and we didn't really stay in touch. I'm closer friends with Mike and Julie than, I kind of lost touch with Jeff. Of course, when I heard about what happened, I mean, it was devastating and so shocking. Um, he believed in the ideals of journalism. He thought journalism was a force for good. He devoted his life to it. I mean, he worked on stories all the time. I'm sure he was always getting phone calls and getting texts. He never had a family. I mean, he had a family, but he never married. He never had kids. His entire world was being an investigative reporter.
Yeah, that's true dedication right there. For people who didn't know Jeff, can you give us an insight into his personality?
Well, I think what you heard during the penalty phase of the trial is a lot about Jeff. I mean, he was devoted to his work. He loved sports. He loved football. He was interested in that. But honestly, I mean, you talk about what he loved his family. I mean, he loved his nieces and nephews and so forth. But what he was most interested in was his work. And he was 69 years old. There was no talk of him ever retiring. He would never have wanted to retire. There was no reason for him to retire. He was still getting good information. He had great sources. I mean, he covered the courts so well when he was doing that job. I mean, he understood how documents and records were an important factor. He had a zillion sources. He they trusted him. They understood that he would never misuse their trust. They knew that if they gave him information, he would never reveal the source. And so he was just so tied in to so many different aspects of Las Vegas um, that he was just a remarkable reporter. The irony is he covered the mob. He has a podcast about the mob. He wasn't ever killed. He was never harmed by a mobster. He was never he was killed by a sort of low level elected leader in Clark County. Um, and he covered far more dangerous people than Robert Tellis.
Yeah, a lot of us talk about how ironic that is. He spent his whole life covering really, really dangerous people.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I think the worst thing that ever happened to him once is he was punched by a mobster. Um, there's a story that he tells, and if you listen to his podcast,
wow, when did that happen?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, there's a lot of information on the podcast that he did. Las Vegas had a mob boss. The last one, um, he covered. It was like in the 1987 when that last sort of mob boss in charge of Las Vegas was killed. But he has so many scoops, so many different stories that he covered. He wrote a book. He could have written many other books.
Did you follow the trial and what did you think about the verdict?
Well, yes, I did follow the trial closely, and I thought the verdict, yeah, I couldn't understand why it took so long. There's a mountain of evidence, circumstantial evidence, direct evidence, the DNA under the fingertips of Jeff, Robert Tellis's DNA found underneath Jeff's fingers. That fingernails, I should say, that is the key piece of evidence. I could not understand why it was taking 3 days to come up with that verdict. And it was the only possible verdict. They finally reached it. I don't know what was happening in the jury room. Apparently, there was some discussion, one juror or maybe more holding out. Um, Thankfully, they came up with the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually spoke with a juror, the jury foreperson today, and he told me really it was because there was so much evidence that it took so long. They had to go through each and every single piece of evidence, and I guess they had over like 400 pieces. But I want to know more about that picture you posted with Jeff. Can you explain where that was?
Boy, I think that was the weekend that we went to Mike's wedding, Mike Smith's wedding in Milwaukee. It was so much fun. I mean, they invited me. Those guys, I didn't even know them that well. And, Mike invited me and we flew to Milwaukee, which I'd never been to Milwaukee. And it was a great, great time. I'm pretty sure that that's the weekend that it was.
Eric, thank you so much for making time. Anything else you'd like to add?
Um, let's see if there's anything. I don't know. I'm so sad about the loss of Jeff. The fact that he was murdered and that he was by himself and that he wasn't discovered until the next day by the neighbors. And those neighbors loved him. And the fact that it just makes me so sad that he died, he was killed by himself there and nobody to help him. And I just feel so terrible about that. I mean, that haunts me.
Yeah, and I mean, you and I are both reporters. Like it really puts things into perspective.
It really does. And what Jeff was doing, honestly, was great work year after year, day after day. Important work, important local journalism. And it's a huge loss. His death, his murder is a huge loss.